Okay, in this video, I'm going to be talking about the questions surrounding inducing infringement, specifically inducing infringement via the internet, right? So historically, or in the previous classes, we've been talking about problems related to secondary liability for copyright infringement using older technologies. Of course, the internet is is designed to, among other things, facilitate the reproduction and distribution and display of digital material, of works of authorship. And so the internet is sort of designed for copyright infringement, as it were. And the question becomes, when are particular uses of the internet or particular kinds of platforms ones that are going to be found liable for secondary infringement of copyrighted content by their users? So this issue really came to a head as the internet began to be adopted more broadly in the late 90s, early 2000s, and especially as it began to be adopted really widely on college campuses. And as you know, college students have little money, but lots of demand for works of authorship. Of course, this is long before the days of streaming and so on. And so college students wanted access to movies, and specifically, or primarily, to music. The internet was sufficiently slow at that point in time that transferring movies over the internet was, for most people unrealistic because the files were too large. But music, especially compressed music, the files were small enough that they could be shared. And so college students were looking to share music files with each other. And an enterprising fellow named Sean Parker, who later went on to work with Mark Zuckerberg and helped create Facebook, his sort of first claim to fame was being the person behind the development of a service called Napster, which greatly facilitated the transfer of music files primarily among students, although really among anyone. And essentially how Napster worked was it provided a central server where different Napster clients could trade those files with each other. Well, understandably, the music publishers, music companies were none too happy with this scenario and immediately pursued Napster for copyright infringement. And because of the way that Napster was set up, it was very clear that Napster knew, or should have known, that the service was being used for copyright infringement and could actually identify which specific transactions were copyright infringing. So it was, it was a foregone conclusion that Napster was going to be found liable for copyright infringement. Indeed, it's pretty clear that Napster was basically liable for direct infringement, or at least directly facilitating secondary infringement by its users. Okay, so when Napster was found liable, a number of alternative ways of essentially doing the same thing by different means were developed, many of which were essentially used as kind of decentralized tools to ensure that the functionality was still there, but the central server didn't know what people were actually transacting in. So in particular, a service called Grockster was created. And essentially what it did was create lots and lots of different nodes. So rather than a central server, you had a sea of different nodes of computers all connected with each other. And the queries, the searches for different files could be passed among all those computers. And as soon as the computer making the query was connected with a computer that had the file, they would connect and the file would get downloaded without the central server ever knowing exactly what took place. And there were others like BitTorrent and so on and so forth that worked in related ways with increasing levels of decentralization and fragmentation of the transmission of information. In any case, unsurprisingly, the content providers, and as you know, in the mid 2000s, as the internet developed and it became possible to share movie files as well as music files, MGM Studios, joined by many other copyright owning publishers, brought a claim against Grockster for secondary infringement. And the question was whether or not Grockster could be liable as a secondary infringer given that it didn't actually know which files its customers were sharing with each other. It set up the system to allow them to do so, but it didn't monitor the actual individual transactions. Should or could it be liable as a secondary infringer? Ultimately, a strong majority of the Supreme Court said yes, essentially saying, look, Grockster was created in order to facilitate infringement of copyright. Indeed, the purpose of the system is to induce as much infringement as possible. And because that's the purpose, Grockster can be liable for copyright infringement. Now, the lower courts found otherwise, right? District court held that Grockster was not a secondary infringer because it lacked knowledge of the actual infringing uses, and it was just providing a technology. And the court was relying on Sony. Said, look, Grockster provides a technology. The technology has multiple uses, and not all the uses are infringing. Grockster doesn't know what the consumers are doing with the product. Therefore, Grockster can't be liable for secondary infringement. A really nice, clean sort of stream of reasoning. The circuit court agreed and affirmed, but the Supreme Court reversed, essentially finding that, look, Grockster knows how its system is going to be used. And in fact, it encourages and profits from the use of its system for infringing, right? So they said, among other things, that Grockster sort of marketed itself to potential consumers as a place where you could find infringing information. Moreover, Grockster profited not by charging its customers, but by running advertisements. And so they wanted, the more volume that they had, the more profits they would make from those advertisements. And the way to generate volume was by encouraging the use of the system for transacting in copyright protected material. So according to the majority of the court, it was clear that MGM and the other content owners had satisfied the standard for surviving a motion for summary judgment and were entitled to bring their claim to trial. A concurrence from the ever copyright protective Justice Ginsburg kind of upped the ante a little bit and essentially said, look, I'm pretty sure that I think that this is infringing and they really ought to be able to pursue this. And in an interesting dissent, Justice Breyer argued otherwise, right? Essentially, Justice Breyer said, look, it's true that this new technology is being used for infringing purposes, but it's also being used for a lot of non-infringing purposes. And in fact, the non-infringing purposes here are about the same in terms of the total volume as the non-infringing uses that were at issue in Sony. And we really shouldn't be squashing new technologies just because they have infringing uses, right? There's a lot of value to the public out of encouraging the development of new technology, and we shouldn't let copyright owners prevent that by preventing the use of those technologies in ways that have multiple different uses, some of which are both non-infringing and on the whole broadly beneficial to consumers. So Justice Breyer, in kind of lonely dissent, was like, look, we should be erring in favor of encouraging technological innovation. And if that means kind of turning a blind eye to some copyright infringement, that is a trade-off worth making. And we should err on the side of technology. After all, look what happened in Sony, right? By virtue of permitting the sale of these machines and not finding Sony to be an infringer, we realized that there was actually a huge market out there that was hugely beneficial to ultimately the copyright owners themselves, who profited enormously from the VCR technology. Ask yourself, since 2005, right? What has happened with this kind of technology and who's primarily benefited from it? In addition, the casebook talks about Section 512 of the DMCA and the notice and takedown provisions, which are intended to insulate internet service providers from copyright infringement liability. So essentially, in the absence of this provision, it'd be very likely that internet companies like YouTube, for example, would be liable for copyright infringement when their users post content that is infringing. After all, they're hosting it and providing that content directly to their customers. 512 of the Section 512 of the DMCA is sort of a compromise. Essentially, it says, look, we're going to hold that, or we're going to provide a safe harbor for these internet platforms from copyright infringement liability by enabling copyright owners to send takedown notices to them. And as long as the company, as long as the platform abides by the terms of these notice and takedown requirements, then they'll be protected from infringement, and the only liable party will be the user who uploaded the content. So essentially what happens is, if a copyright owner encounters what they believe to be a copyright infringement, they can send a takedown notice to the platform, say YouTube, right? When YouTube receives the notice, it immediately removes the content from the site and sends a notification to its user that uploaded the content. It says, look, we've received a takedown notice. If the material you've uploaded is in fact infringing, you can accept the notice and essentially take a hit to your rating. And if you have too many marks, black marks on your rating, your account will be suspended. Your alternative is to file a counter notice and say, no, this notice is mistaken, and in fact, the material in question is not infringing, and therefore it shouldn't be taken down. If you do that, you have to provide all of your contact information such that the copyright owner will be able to sue you, and in fact, you have to consent to jurisdiction. Even you have to kind of tee up a lawsuit for them, and if they can either choose to file a lawsuit, in which case the material will remain removed, or if they fail to respond, they fail to file a copyright infringement action, then after typically it's 2 weeks, the material will be restored to the internet, right? And this entire process is intended to offload the risk of liability from the platform onto the user and ensure that the copyright owners are mollified in a sense by being told, look, normally the reason you would want to bring an action against the platform is because it's too hard to locate the users. It can be anonymous and so on and so forth. The notice and takedown provisions ensure that if this is in fact an infringement of your copyright, then you'll know who the user is and you'll be able to bring that action against them.